energy resources, civilian infrastructure, and in parallel a propaganda campaign was conducted. The model proposed by Colonel Joe Warden, named The War from Within to Outside, his view of the enemy as a system, and the theory of 5 strategic rings provided theoretical and practical justification for the following conflicts, particularly in former Yugoslavia. Thus, due to the efforts of Admirals Owens, Johnson, and Vice Admiral Sibrovsky, was developed a concept of net-centric warfare that reflected those changes that occurred in the commercial and information environment of the United States. Having logically assumed that these changes will necessarily affect the military sphere, the Pentagon itself began to intensively adopt information systems, armaments, and the most important intellectual personnel of the new generation warfare. Parallel to this, analysts of the Rand Corporation, John Arkilla and David Ronfeld, drew attention to the phenomenon of street fights and guerrillas in Latin America that had the support of the masses, for example, the anti-globalist protest and Zapatista revolt in Mexico. The new form of the social conflict they called the net war, having defined its actors: network warriors, which can be both drug cartels and radical universalist and animal rights groups. The structures from a chain network, hub or star network, or all-channel network, types of organizations and their doctrines, technologies and social connections. In addition, we must pay attention to the so-called non-violent resistance. The winner's laurel in this issue is given to the Indian fighter for independence, Mahatma Gandhi, but for modern conditions for different countries, this method was adapted and developed by the founder of the Albert Einstein Institute, Gene Sharp. During the collapse of the Soviet Union, he was an advisor to separatists from the Baltic countries, and all the color revolution from Yugoslavia to Arabic countries, where the Muslim Brotherhood were implementing methods described in Sharp's book From Dictatorship to Democracy, were held with active consultation with the Albert Einstein Institute's employees and other structures related with it. Moreover, the financial support for regime change in Ukraine, Georgia, Serbia, Kyrgyzstan, Egypt, and Tunisia was provided by the United States Agency of International Development, USAID. It will be no exaggeration to say that CIA and other intelligence services of the United States took part in initiatives to regime change, which have learned to sophisticatedly manipulate nationalist culture and dissident movements since the Cold War. No less interesting is chaos strategy proposed by American diplomat Stephen Mann in 1992. He proposed to adapt the chaos theory of modern physics to geopolitics, having said that there is nothing wrong with that whole states collapse because such is the property of any complex system. After its collapse comes the period of equilibrium. He thought this theory unlikely to relate to the United States of America, because in the publication Chaos Theory and Strategic Thought, he compared state system with hardware and ideology with software, where in the United States military, the destruction of state's computer system is equivalent to the destruction of that state. According to Mann, it's easier to inject a virus into computer system, in this particular case of an open society like the United States, in order to capture state's computers from within and to preserve the integrity of their configuration. At the same time, there appeared other terms: people-centric war, effect-based operation, television war, cyber war, etc., that reflected one or another aspects of conflicts. As before, one scientist created nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, now military experiments are held outside with social, civic, political, and ethnic structures in different countries. Through various virtual simulations, from training to street fighting, computer games teach how to organize acts of terrorism and to overthrow governments, and the Pentagon has initiated new agencies, such as Cyber Command and Space Command, to achieve, as it stated in the official documents of the Ministry of Defense of the United States, full spectrum dominance on the land, in the air, in space and cyberspace. And they don't hide the fact that the military manipulates social networks, Twitter, Facebook, BlackBerry, and such networks, using them to incite violence and force the escalation of conflicts, such as the events in Iran, Syria, London, and New York. Also, the use of force against citizens of the United States and Great Britain did not result in radical political reform, which the United States State Department constantly shouts of in relation to other sovereign states. This indicates that the West stands behind the blur of sovereignties and cultures resulting from large transnational corporations, the interests of which are the equally greedy goals of world domination, but with rather different methods, by the control of production and distribution of essential goods such as water, food, medicines, shelter, and various essential services. Given the negative aspects of globalization, we can note that now we are in a specific historical point where the new model of conflict conditionally has finished there where it began, in the Middle East. Indeed, this whole potential was used in Libya. In addition to direct military aggression, earlier was launched a program of destabilizing the local population via the militants of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups of North Africa and Middle East, as well as militants of competing countries such as Qatar. The media campaign of BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera and other Western resources worked in parallel with electronic suppression of Libyan official resources. And now Western and transnational corporations invade Libya together with private military companies. However, this conflict will not end soon. Close ahead are other potential targets of the West, Syria and Iran, eternally warring Palestine and African countries, growing from Western neocolonialism. That's why the serious struggle lies ahead. The main question is to choose the right side. You've been watching Stratagems with Leo Savin. See you soon on GRAnews.
Геополитика хаоса была запущена. Арабский мир вздрогнул и пришел в движение. В Ливии это приобрело самые жесткие и жестокие формы. Разразился кровопролитный конфликт, завершившийся вторжением войск НАТО.
Россия поддержала резолюцию Совета Безопасности 1970 и пропустила резолюцию 1973. Именно в целях защиты населения и недопущения эскалации конфликта.
Главную роль во всей этой истории, конечно же, играли Соединенные Штаты Америки. Сегодня никто в мире больше не сомневается, что в их лице мы имеем дело с империей, и империализмом и колониализмом худшего пошиба. Впрочем, с начала 2000-х они сами себя все чаще так называют – American Empire. Особенно откровенные и довольно циничные неоконцы. Project for New American Century. Мол, да, это гегемония, примите это как факт. Но для приличия назовем ее добренькой гегемонией. Benevolent hegemony. Да уж, ничего себе benevolent. Каждый день тысячи невинных людей, простых граждан, детей, женщин, стариков гибнут от этой добренькой гегемонии, и площадки ее развертывания растут день ото дня. Афганистан, Ирак, Ливия, завтра Сирия, на очереди Иран, далее везде. Benevolent. О роли США в этой бойне и о влиянии событий в Ливии на систему международных отношений все расскажет специалист в этой сфере, постоянно ведущий рубрики Dissent Mark Sleboda. United States of America. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Natella. I am Mark Sleboda, and welcome to the world of Dissent. America has, in the lapse of nearly half a century, without a single exception, respected the independence of other nations while asserting and maintaining her own. She has abstained from interference in the concerns of others, even when conflict has been for principles to which she clings, as to the last vital drop that visits the heart. She has seen that probably for centuries to come, all the contests of that Al-Qadama, the European world, will be contests of inveterate power and emerging right. Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will her heart, her benedictions, and her prayers be. But she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. She will commend the general cause by the countenance of her voice and the benignant sympathy of her example. She well knows that by once enlisting under other banners than her own, were they even the banners of foreign independence, she would involve herself beyond the power of extrication in all the wars of interest and intrigue, of individual avarice, envy, and ambition, which assume the colors and usurp the standard of freedom. The fundamental maxims of her policy would insensibly change from liberty to force. She might become the dictatress of the world. She would no longer be the ruler of her own spirit. So said John Quincy Adams, 6th President of the United States of America, in his warning against the search for monsters to destroy in 1821. On the 17th of March, 2011, the United Nations Security Council passed UNSCR 1973. A resolution at least rhetorically designed to protect civilians amidst an insurrection in Libya that was never proved to exceed a tribally and geographically based and largely religiously fundamentalist minority of the Libyan population. In reality, the resolution and the insurrection that spawned it would become a fig leaf disguise and justification for Western powers and their allied Arab dictatorships to undertake as Stephen Walt, writing for Foreign Policy, characterizes it, a classic case of foreign-imposed regime change, or FIRC, of the government of the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya, and the installation of a puppet government of ex-regime figures and returned exiles that would be more aligned to Western hegemonic and geopolitical interests in the region. Also, of course, to bring Libyan energy and water resources fully into the global market and under greater control of European energy companies, to help ensure a stable supply of energy to the EU that does not depend on Russia. Geopolitics, expansion of the global capitalist system, and energy security. The resolution was passed with 10 yes votes and 5 abstentions. Russia, China, Brazil, India, and Germany. The BRICS showed admirable unity here in their joint position of abstaining, and then later in their joint and visceral condemnation of NATO's perversion and blatant violations of the mandate of UNSCR 1973. However, ultimately they failed to uphold their duties and responsibilities as Security Council members to preserve both international peace and the principles of the UN Charter. Personally, I blame Russian President Dmitry Medvedev for the fall of Libya, and I believe he shares responsibility for all the deaths that have followed, as he broke with the long-standing Russian foreign policy tradition of upholding the UN Charter's foundation of the inviolability of state sovereignty. He abstained in an attempt to curry favor with Western powers for his domestic modernization agenda, or as it should more correctly be called, neoliberalism. With this turnaround, Medvedev's administration faced disagreement and opposition from Prime Minister Putin, from within the foreign ministry, and even from Russia's ambassador to Libya, who reportedly wrote Medvedev a letter calling him a traitor to the motherland for his selling out of Libya before he was recalled. At the point the resolution was passed, the insurrection had been quickly rolled back and contained by the Libyan army to the eastern city of Benghazi. Libya's government needed 1 or 2 weeks at most to put down the rebellion and to restore law and order to the country. A Russian veto would have stopped cold, or at least stalled with political indecision, NATO's military plans. Given that time, all the deaths and destruction of Libya's infrastructure and society could have been avoided, and Gaddafi and his sons would still be alive and with us today. The passing of UNSCR 1973 and the immediately subsequent military intervention were legally justified under the doctrine of the right to protect, or R2P. The Security Council's remit to interfere in the sovereign state would seem to be non-existent, as the conflict was contained in its entirety to the territory of Libya, and as thus presented no threat or breach of international peace and security. The most essential founding principle of the existing international system and the United Nations Charter, which legally defines it, is that of state sovereignty and of non-interference in their domestic affairs. Article 2 guarantees the sovereign equality of all member states. Article 2, Section 4 states, "All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations." Article 2, Section 7 states, "Nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, or shall require the members to submit such matters to settlement under the present charter." R2P is a revisionist challenge to existing international law, first proposed by the US, the EU, Canada, and other Western states in the heady unipolar moment of the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Advocates of R2P argue that sovereignty is not a right but a responsibility, and that a state must protect its civilians, or its sovereignty can be violated and taken away. The doctrine of R2P has never achieved the status of international law, because states were not willing to embody this principle in a binding treaty. Instead, it is presented as an emergent principle or norm. In other words, its proponents are trying by stealth to rewrite the United Nations Charter and existing international law, and thus the existing international order of states, and thus to forge a new world order. Western states have applied it selectively and hypocritically, to say the least. The truth is that R2P is too capacious a norm to regulate states. It can be cited to justify virtually any intervention in any country that the West might want to invade, while it can also be evaded on grounds that it is not formal law. So Western countries can avoid intervening in a crisis when intervention does not suit their interests. R2P is not a needed reform to the international system, but a threat to its legitimacy and to the stability of the international order. The threshold of failure to protect is the 4 mass atrocity crimes of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. There is no evidence that the suppression of intermixed armed rebels and protesters reached anywhere near these levels in Libya. There was no independent investigation or inspection of the events in Libya conducted by the UN, as has become standard procedure for such accusations. Western states cited the urgent and immediate need to prevent a bloodbath or massacre in Benghazi. However, there is no reason to suspect this was the case. There were no massacres of the civilian population in any of the other cities or towns that the Libyan government had restored order to. Western mainstream media carried salacious and horrifying tabloidish front-page stories and primetime broadcast reports of massacres of protesters, systematic mass rape, and the firing on crowds of civilians by the Libyan Air Force. This information was repeated in the UN Human Rights Council and the United Nations Security Council as if it were fact. Evidence of these atrocities presented to the Security Council was merely word of mouth. The newly formed independent Libyan NGO, which presented these accusations, turned out to have several members of the rebel Transitional National Council's leadership on its own board. Later, no corroborating evidence of any of these reports was to be found. Human Rights Watch has reported at the time of the passing of UNSCR 1973, after 1 month of conflict, there were only 233 people killed in Libya, on both sides of the conflict. Later, at 2 months into the conflict, Human Rights Watch released data on Misrata, the 3rd biggest city in Libya and scene of the most heavy and protracted fighting, and revealed that the Libyan government was not deliberately massacring civilians, but rather narrowly targeting the armed rebels who fought against the government. Misrata's population is roughly 400,000. In the first 2 months of the war, only 257 people, including combatants, died there. Of the 949 wounded, only 22, less than 3%, were women. Human Rights Watch conclude that if Gaddafi were indiscriminately targeting civilians, women would comprise about half the casualties. Clearly, in their frenzied rush to instigate regime change and remove a so-called dictator who had at this point been so demonized in the Western mainstream media for decades that people were willing to believe him capable of anything, evidence of atrocities were fabricated and presented as fact. When R2P supporters advocated the doctrine before the United Nations in the middle of the last decade, they emphasized its non-military aspects and insisted that the use of force would be a rare last resort. Yet in Libya, force almost immediately followed the ultimatums issued to Gaddafi. 2 ceasefires proposed by Gaddafi and 1 by the African Union were immediately and summarily rejected by NATO and rebel leaders. The principal form of UNSCR 1973, R2P, was supposedly a no-fly zone to protect civilians and civilian-populated areas from attack. However, even the United States military has had to admit that they had no evidence or confirmation that at any time in the civil unrest or conflict did Gaddafi's Air Force ever fire on civilians or civilian-populated areas. Under R2P, no-fly zone has become an Orwellian euphemism for NATO using its air force, drones, and cruise missiles to bomb a state's military, government, infrastructure, and cities into oblivion. Ironically, now that Gaddafi and his family have been brutally murdered by rebel mobs, after being captured as prisoners of war, including anal rape with an American-made bayonet, castration, being dragged through the streets behind a truck, and then finally shot in the head. And with Human Rights Watch reporting mass and systematic abuse, summary executions, arbitrary arrest and detention by militias, torture, arson, looting, and the lynching and ethnic cleansing of Libyan and African blacks in every city and town taken by the rebels. It appears that if NATO's true concern were human rights and protecting civilians, that rather than bombing Sirte and Bani Walid, they should have been targeting the rebels. As a result, everywhere outside Western Europe and North America, R2P is losing what little ethical credibility it ever commanded. This should surprise no one. A doctrine of intervention that both claims the moral high ground and clamors its universality, but under which the interveners are always from the global north, and the intervened upon always from the global south, is not moral progress. It is geopolitical business as usual. In The Liberal Defense of Murder, Richard Seymour believes that the U.S. has long been engaged in an imperial enterprise in the name of R2P, and that its foot soldiers include a great number of liberals and progressives. He casts these thinkers and writers as enablers. Imperialism is not a distant relic, but a living reality, he wrote. And the moralization of the means of violence has been the task of liberal and progressive intellectuals since they first competed with clerics for moral authority. R2P should be properly known not as humanitarian intervention, but for what it is, humanitarian imperialism. The war in Libya is a creation of liberal intellectuals, just as the war in Iraq was a creation of neoconservatives. Many of the liberal intellectuals in the West who vigorously opposed the Iraq War have been just as vigorously advocating intervention in Libya. Both groups are serenely convinced of their own moral rightness. Yet the delusions of the R2P crowd aren't all that different from the delusions of the neocons, who thought they could march into Iraq, decapitate the dictator, and help the cheering throngs embrace democracy. Has the past decade taught these people nothing? Now, there is already talk among Western politicians of using the example set in Libya, what is already being referred to by liberals as the Obama doctrine, or the Libyan model, next in Syria, and then Iran. And similar threats have even been uttered by U.S. Senator John McCain against Russia and China. The United Nations in international law has for the past 20 years been little more than the playground and tool of the U.S. and its Western allies to further and legitimize Western global hegemony. The attempt to characterize the doctrine of R2P as an emergent norm can clearly be seen as a revisionist attempt to rewrite the UN Charter and international law, and thus reshape the existing international order to their interests and whims. The BRICS nations must not give up and surrender these institutions, but actively engage in a political and legal fight to preserve international law and the United Nations, as they still represent the best framework to develop a truly international and multipolar future, with the Democratic Assembly of the UN General Assembly and the United Nations Security Council allowing for a dialogue between the great powers and civilizations. R2P presents probably the greatest normative threat to this future. It is Russia and China's duties as members of the Security Council to resist the revisionism of R2P and its use as justification for military force to advance geopolitical and national interests, even when, such as in Libya, it does not threaten their own core interests. Thus, they will preserve the UN Charter and safeguard international peace and stability. It is a duty. true responsibility, a moral obligation, and also within their own long-term national and security interests. The famous old maxim of first they came for the communists and I said nothing because I am not a communist applies to international affairs as well. Otherwise, Libya's grim fate could await Russia, China, and the other BRICS as well. These are the harsh lessons that must be learned from Libya. The monster that needs to be destroyed is R2P. This has been our voice of global dissent. Thank you for listening and participating online. Until next time.
Мы приближаемся к драматической развязке, к гибели вождя Джамахирии, последнему герою третьей идеологии, к концу Муаммара Каддафи. Спокойно на эти кадры, обошедшие мир, смотреть невозможно.
ولم تؤكد فيما إذا كان القذافي يصيب في تلك الغارة. لاحقا علمت العربية.
Можно относиться к Каддафи по-разному и по-разному оценивать Джамахирию. Но быть безучастным к этой подлой и унизительной расправе натовских шавок над последним революционером по сути то же самое, что быть соучастником этого гадкого преступления. Сегодня вам кажется, что ваше дело сторона, но завтра натовской бомбой убьет вашего ребенка, а ваш муж, брат, сын сгинет в очередной бесконечной войне добренькой мировой империи. Сила требует уважения, но сила, сеющая зло, убийство, унижение и, самое главное, невыносимую ложь, взывает только к одному – к восстанию. Ответом на все это может быть только одно слово – месть. So rise, don't be afraid. Together, the people of the world will certainly win. Каддафи мертв. Натовские оккупанты и местные ливийские шестерки добились своего. Ну и что? В Ливии мир, счастье, покой, демократия? Да как бы не так. Впереди только нескончаемые потоки крови. Одни научатся в них плавать, другим предстоит захлебнуться. The rise and the fall of the green country. Героическая сага о революции и судьбе третьей идеологии, прямой демократии и социальном государстве в третьем мире. Каддафи вписан в историю как герой. Его убийцы стерты из памяти человечества уже при жизни. Хотя золотой телец, установивший над планетой свою преступную кровавую диктатуру, еще стучит копытцем, дни его сочтены. Каддафи сражался до последнего. Его убили не враги, не авиаудары по суверенной стране, не горстка продажных ублюдков из ПНС. Его убила ложь, трусость, пассивность обществ, завороженных магией олигархических СМИ, сетями политкорректности, сном страха. Пора порвать эти цепи глобальной несвободы. Мы живем в матрице, где зло называется добреньким, а герой – подонком. Где воришка в почете, а гений на свалке. Это неправильный мир. Мир, в котором погибает Каддафи, а его враги торжествуют. Правильным мир будет тогда, когда все поменяется местами. Конец мировой капиталистической системы неизбежен и близок как никогда. И наша цель его приблизить любыми средствами. Секунды имеют значение. Только так мы продолжим твое дело, полковник Каддафи. The scourge of capitalism must be defeated. And it certainly will, if we all continue the struggle together to the very end. Remember, there is only one solution – revolution. This is Natella Speranskaya, signing out till next time. You have been watching GRAnews. You can find us on the internet at granews.info. And remember, après le déluge, nous.